who are in trying to discover the Northwest Passage and are frozen in 1854 and have been there for 3 years. Somehow they still have whiskey. So I'm glad to see that this is true on the Oregon Trail as well.
Priorities, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, it also makes for a currency of its own to some degree. I mean, I don't want to overstate that, but, and you could say this of any other supply, you're going to trade out there. I mean, if your axle or your wheel's broken in an irreplaceable, you can't fix it sort of way, well, that bottle of whiskey or maybe that extra change of clothes, something may be exactly what you need to entice some other pioneer that, isn't keen to part with their only spare wheel into trading with you.
Also, for those who actually make it to the Oregon Territory, what happens to those who are successful? And are they farmers? Are they setting up industry? Are they working in timber? What does it look like to those who are actually able to complete the trail?
So farming is by and far what's happening. I mean, there are other industries that are set up. We just touched on the enterprising forts and other such opportunities. We talked a little bit about salmon pickling, which I apologize. You're going to get an email from someone who's like, "Hey, salmon pickling's awesome."
It's a good source of probiotics. Back off.
Absolutely. I enjoy salmon. No disrespect to the salmon picklers out there. We appreciate what you do. I totally didn't know that. Before studying the Oregon Trail, I did not realize that salmon pickling was such a staple back then. But farming is hands down what most of them are going to do. Many of them are farmers. They've been hit so hard by the 1837 panic. And by the way, just to make sure we're clear on definitions, panic is just the old school term for economic recession or depression. Mm-hmm. And the 1837 panic is the worst economic downturn that the United States experiences until the Great Depression in the 20th century. So there's lots of impetus for people to head out. And it's the quality of the land in Oregon country is another thing that's drawing people. I mean, think about this. Why are people going from Missouri all the way out to Oregon country and eventually to California as well?
If the farmland is better, it's easier to produce crops.
Exactly. I mean, you don't want to stop somewhere in the middle there. It's just not as good of a land. There's a reason that you're willing to walk over 2,000 miles because that land is really promising. So that's the main economy.
We alluded to one figure earlier, and it's best to wheel back around to him. So Lansford Hastings.
Yes.
Why should we know about him?
Oh, Lansford is, he's my favorite character on the Oregon Trail. So he's an Ohio-born lawyer. But in 1842, he makes the trek across to Oregon country. His party has some hiccups. He ends up becoming the captain halfway through after their first captain decided that all the dogs in the party need to be put to death. Yep, that was a thing.
Pretty grisly.
It is. He convinced everyone to go along with it. We don't know exactly what his deal was, if he was afraid that they were barking too much and Indians were going to come or what. But after about the 20th or 22nd dog being killed, the party said, okay, we're done. This is really grotesque and you've lost this battle, sir. By the way, a few days later or weeks later, they were voting you out too. So Lansford comes in, he gets his little leadership role. He manages to get into some trouble with Indians at Independence Rock, which that's a fun landmark along the Oregon Trail. Kind of like how, well, it's been stopped in recent years, but it was a big thing a few years back to go to, if you were in Paris, to put a lock on the bridges. Do you remember that phase?
Yeah.
So, and of course, it eventually, Paris was like, please stop. You're putting so many locks on these bridges. You're damaging them. Well, Independence Rock is kind of where all the cool kids who are going across the Oregon Trail, they're going to scratch their name into it. So Lansford goes up there to scratch his name into it, and he ends up getting captured. I believe it was by the Sioux. But he manages to get back to his party. They get to Oregon, and he then goes down to California. He's an ambitious guy. He writes a book. It's the book that I cited a little bit earlier, The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. And this is basically your, this might date me a little bit for some of the younger listeners, but do you remember the Thomas Guide books back before we had smartphones?
It's one of those. I get all of those confused. The Let's Go books, the whatever.
Yeah.
They all just kind of blend together into some.
You know the genre, though, right? Like this.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and it was a staple. You'd keep it in the car. I remember my parents always had one. So this book, you live by it in so many ways. It's where you're a city slicker, so you want to go across the Oregon Trail, but you're going to go buy a copy of this because it's going to tell you what supplies you need, what skills you need, which way to go. All of that's in there. So, he's basically made himself into a very well-known and successful author. However, in his pursuit for glory, he suggests a shortcut, and shortcuts are referred to as cutoffs. And this cutoff says to break away from the traditional path on the Oregon Trail when you get to, I believe it was Fort Hall. Forgive me. I'm pretty sure it was Fort Hall. But to break off towards the Wasatch Mountains in what is today Utah and cut by by Salt Lake City. This is if you want to go to California, I should be clear. And then you can hook up with the traditional California trail that's broken from the Oregon Trail up in Idaho. And you'll connect with it in Nevada. Was that clear enough?
I get what you're going for.
Yeah, okay.
I see your saying.
Long story short, it's supposedly a shortcut. Well, okay. So the year after he's written his book, the Donner Party in 1846, they go, awesome.
Yes.
Let's take this shortcut. It'd be great to get there faster, right? Yeah. Turns out it's not a shortcut. This is what happens when a guy who hasn't actually traveled the path decides to just claim it's a shortcut. They're delayed by a solid month as they hack their way through the Wasatch Mountains. Just no trail whatsoever. And that's what sets them up for being too late as they're coming across and getting stuck in the snow, ultimately, suffering huge casualties and resorting to eating their own dead.
Did this come back to Hastings? Did he get any repercussions for writing a book that caused people to fall into cannibalism?
Not so much. He kind of dodges it. Because he's basically ready to just pin it back on them. And in the era that just seems to fly a little bit more. I mean, I look at it today, as I believe pretty much all other historians do, and go, wow, you are essentially responsible for what happened to the Donner Party. The most famous tragedy of, if we talk about, again, the Oregon Trail in a larger, all trails headed west sort of sense, the most famous tragedy, it kind of lays at his feet. And another kind of fun, footnote here is that trail that the Donner Party carves, it ends up being the path that the Mormons are going to take when they decide to actually go and stay in Salt Lake, showing up the year after the Donner Party in 1847, which I'd hardly call that a silver lining. I think the Mormons would have been fine cutting their own path. At least it got used again. That's the only thing I can say for it. It's horrific, and it's because he suggested this path. But this guy, such a crazy life. It doesn't end there. When we get to the Civil War, he's still out west. He throws in with the Union, 180 degrees. He throws in with the Confederacy, eventually heads east, meets with Robert Lee at one point, trying to talk about how he's going to flip California for the Confederacy. Spoiler alert, that's not going to work for him. And he eventually leaves the United States, heads down to the Caribbean, and that's where he dies.
This is after the Confederates are defeated.
Yes. Does
he leave the United States because of the loss of the Civil War?
I will readily concede that I know him better in the Oregon Trail context. My shooting from the hip, I would imagine he's probably with the, what was the term for them? Confederados?
Oh, right,
You know?
yeah.
I mean, and again, I'm just shooting from the hip there, but knowing that there are a number of Southerners who, after the Civil War, go, well, fine, we'll head elsewhere, and many of them end up, I believe, in Brazil. That's just the context that makes sense to me. But I want to completely clarify. I'm shooting from the hip on how he ends up there on his deathbed. But this guy just traverses the whole, North America / down to the, Caribbean. This guy's all over the map. He writes the book. He causes the Donner Party. Lansford Hastings he's a name to remember if you're talking or thinking about the Oregon Trail.
Yeah, he might be the patron saint of being on the wrong side of American history. So I like to think that if he'd been alive in the 40s or 50s, he would have been a proud Dixiecrat and run for a political office on that party ticket and broken off with them. So in terms of the Oregon Trail and how we look back on it, we mentioned these certain figures, especially the early people who are in some senses failing. They're not living up to the original mission of what the Oregon Trail could be, whether it's to solidify American presence in the West or to strike it rich when there's all these things that aren't working. Some of the people we looked at didn't live up to the mission, but do you see success stories of those who made the Oregon Trail work according to its original purpose?
Well, sure. I mean, you do have plenty of people who do establish successful farms. They might not be as famous, but they get their local economy going. They found cities that today are massive, and what you think of when you are thinking of the Western United States, places like Portland. There are other figures that also loom large in more successful ways. John C. Fremont, for instance, who, again, we're getting into California there, but he's a failed nominee for. I just said success, and now I go fail. But he runs as the first Republican for president of the United States. I mean, not that he doesn't have skeletons in his closet, but he basically becomes this successful, famous individual in the American West. Of course, the gold rush, that's another thing that brings people out west, and of course, that is plenty of failure with a few massive success stories out there, and then others who make successes off of those successes. We get Levi jeans out of eventually, down the road. We're more to the late 19th century by that point. But lots of other things that grow out of it. And I think an important thing to keep in mind, Scott, is that we tend to focus on these successes for all the tragedy and the death and the failures. We look at these successes, and I feel like that all feeds into the American dream. Whether we believe the American dream is a real thing or it's a facade that we've sold ourselves, as people look at these pioneers who, and this kind of gets into some of the mythology, which, it is true that the pioneers, these are brave people. I would not want to do what they did. Like I said earlier, I mean, if you said, hey, take your family, just go walk 2,000 miles, 1 in 20 chance you're dying, by the way.
Only 1 in 20.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess that's better than what I would have thought. So that's something.
Yeah. I mean, it's about 5%, but would you get in your car and feel good about the idea that, there's a 5% chance you're going to die?
Yeah, good
right.
point.
Like, would you get on a plane today? You're going to fly across the country. Let's even say it's the Oregon Trail equivalent. You're going to fly from Independence up to the Northwest. You're flying into Portland, and the captain, gets on. Well, welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking. Before we land, 1 in 20 of you will be dead, but we hope you have a pleasant flight, and there will be in-flight snacks. I think we'd all be like, "Whoa, what? No, thank you. Open the door."
To be fair, I have flown on Spirit Airlines, and I think it's about that level of service. So I think it seems about like that.
As you say that, I realize you're actually braver than the pioneers. Yeah, I tip my hat to you, sir. Well done.
I probably did get dysentery, but yeah, I think that.
But thank goodness for Pepto-Bismol and other.
I mean, you are right, because these are people who are coming after the Donner Party. And the Donner Party, of course, is a huge media sensation in the United States. So people were